Today, the world woke up to a moment that may come to be remembered as one of the most shocking geopolitical flashpoints of the decade. Because in the early hours of the morning, while much of the globe was still asleep, the administration of Donald Trump announced what it described as a decisive and extraordinary operation against Venezuela, an announcement that sent shockwaves through capitals, newsrooms, markets, and living rooms everywhere, as reports began to flood in of explosions over Caracas, of power outages, of terrified civilians looking up at the night sky as military aircraft roared overhead. And then, almost as if to underline the gravity of what was unfolding, a message appeared from the president himself, stating that Venezuelan leader Nicolas Maduro had been captured and removed from the country, a claim that instantly escalated the situation from an already volatile military action into a full-blown international crisis. Because according to U.S. officials, the strikes were not symbolic, not limited, not a warning shot, but a coordinated and deliberate operation aimed at dismantling what Washington has long described as a criminal regime. And as the sun rose over South America, the sounds of detonations were still echoing through parts of the capital, with smoke drifting above military installations, communications briefly severed, and Venezuelan state media scrambling to regain control of the narrative, while government spokespeople denounced what they called an act of aggression and demanded proof of life for their president, while at the same time, U.S. officials doubled down, insisting the operation was lawful, necessary, and long overdue, framing it as the culmination of years of accusations involving narcotics trafficking, electoral manipulation, and authoritarian rule. And as this information spread in real time across social media platforms, the reaction was immediate and visceral, with supporters of Trump hailing the move as bold and historic, while critics warned that the world was standing on the edge of a dangerous precipice, because never in recent history has a sitting U.S. president openly claimed the capture of another nation's head of state in this manner, and the uncertainty only deepened as conflicting reports emerged from Caracas, some claiming Maduro had been moved, others insisting he remained in hiding, and still others suggesting fractures within Venezuela's military command, all while civilians lined up for fuel, food, and water amid fears of prolonged instability. And as the hours passed, it became clear that this was not merely a regional incident, but a global event, with allies and adversaries alike urgently assessing what this meant for international law, for sovereignty, for the precedent it sets, and for what might come next, because markets wavered, oil prices reacted, diplomatic hotlines lit up, and emergency meetings were quietly convened behind closed doors, while Trump, speaking in stark and unapologetic terms, framed the operation as a victory for justice and security, portraying it as the removal of a threat rather than the opening of a new conflict. Yet even as he spoke, analysts cautioned that the true consequences were still unfolding, that Venezuela's political future was now profoundly uncertain, that retaliation or internal collapse could follow, and that the region could be pushed into a period of turbulence unseen in years. And so today will be remembered not just for what was said or claimed, but for the collective holding of breath that followed, for the realization that power was being exercised openly and dramatically on the world stage, and that the story is far from over. Because as night falls again over Caracas and Washington alike, one question hangs heavily in the air, asked in different languages and tones around the world. What happens next? And how close are we now to a reshaping of global order that no one can fully predict? As the hours pressed on and the initial shock began to settle into a tense global vigilance, the magnitude of what unfolded today continued to crystallize. Because this was not merely an announcement or a press release or a carefully staged diplomatic maneuver, this was a moment where the machinery of power moved visibly and violently, where the decisions of Donald Trump were no longer theoretical, but audible, visible, and felt across borders, as people in Venezuela described, waking to windows rattling, lights flickering out, cell signals dropping, and the unmistakable sound of explosions rolling through neighborhoods that had already endured years of economic collapse and political paralysis. And in Washington, the language used was deliberate and forceful, emphasizing resolve, authority, and finality, while carefully framing the operation as a targeted action rather than an invasion. Yet outside official statements, the world interpreted it as something far larger. Because when a U.S. president publicly asserts that Nicolas Maduro has been seized and removed from power, the implications ripple instantly through international law, diplomatic norms, and the fragile balance that keeps conflicts contained rather than cascading. And as analysts dissected timelines and satellite imagery and statements from both sides, one thing became increasingly clear. This operation had been planned quietly, executed quickly, and revealed suddenly, creating an information vacuum filled with speculation, fear, triumphalism, and disbelief all at once, with Venezuelan officials scrambling to project control even as emergency decrees were declared, and security forces mobilized, while citizens shared videos and voice notes describing sirens, roadblocks, and an atmosphere thick with uncertainty. And in the United States, the political response fractured predictably along familiar lines, with some lawmakers praising the move as decisive leadership and others warning that unilateral military action risks igniting consequences that cannot be easily reversed. Yet beyond partisan reactions, the deeper unease lay in the precedent being set, because history teaches that moments like these rarely end cleanly. And as the day progressed, international leaders issued carefully worded statements expressing concern, condemnation, or calls for restraint. Each choice of language weighed for what it signaled to allies and adversaries alike, while behind the scenes, emergency diplomatic channels buzzed with urgent conversations about oil markets, regional stability, refugee flows, and the possibility of retaliatory action, either from within Venezuela or from actors aligned with it. And for Venezuelans themselves, the question was immediate and personal, not abstract or strategic, because regardless of who governs tomorrow, tonight they face uncertainty, shortages, and fear. And this reality stood in stark contrast to the grand narratives being broadcast elsewhere, highlighting once again the human cost that often fades behind geopolitical drama. And as Trump's supporters amplified his statements across digital platforms, framing the operation as justice delivered and history made, critics countered with warnings about escalation and blowback, pointing out that removing a leader does not automatically remove the structures, loyalties, and tensions beneath him. And as night approached, it became evident that verification lagged behind declaration, that claims were being asserted faster than they could be independently confirmed. And this gap itself became a central feature of the moment, because in modern conflict perception often moves faster than proof, shaping reactions before facts fully emerge. And so today's events unfolded, not just on the ground, but across screens, feeds, and broadcasts, where millions watched, argued, celebrated, or worried in real time, all aware that they were witnessing something that will be debated, analyzed, and reinterpreted for years to come. And as a reporter speaking to you now, what stands out most is not only the scale of what has been claimed, but the speed with which the world has been forced to respond. Because within a single day, assumptions that felt stable yesterday now feel fragile, alliances are being tested, doctrines are being re-examined, and the question of how power is exercised in the modern era has been thrust into the spotlight. And so this moment lingers not as a conclusion, but as an opening chapter, one filled with unanswered questions, competing narratives, and the unmistakable sense that something irreversible has begun. Because when force is used so openly, and authority asserted so dramatically, the aftershocks do not fade quickly, they echo. And tonight those echoes are being felt far beyond Caracas and Washington, reaching into every conversation about security, sovereignty, and the future of global order, leaving the world watching, waiting, and wondering what tomorrow will bring. And as the day stretched onward, carrying with it the weight of disbelief and the momentum of history in motion, the picture grew not clearer, but heavier, layered with urgency, contradiction, and the unmistakable feeling that the world had crossed a threshold it could not simply step back from. Because when Donald Trump spoke again, his words did not soften or retreat, but reinforced the narrative of decisive action, of a moment seized rather than deferred. And in doing so, he forced every government, every institution, and every observer to recalibrate in real time, as officials across Venezuela attempted to project calm, while simultaneously bracing for instability, deploying security forces, restricting movement, and urging loyalty, at a time when uncertainty was seeping into every layer of daily life. Because regardless of political allegiance, the sudden shock of explosions, power failures, and international attention has a way of unifying fear even as it divides opinion. And while state television spoke of resistance and sovereignty, The streets told a more complex story of confusion, anxiety, and waiting. People clustered around radios and phones, trading rumors faster than confirmations could arrive, and this disconnect between official messaging and lived experience became one of the defining features of the day, mirrored on the global stage, where governments issued statements carefully calibrated to avoid escalation, while still signaling alignment or disapproval. And hovering over all of it was the unresolved question surrounding Nicolas Maduro. Because in international politics, absence can be as powerful as presence, and the lack of independently verified visibility turned his status into both a symbol and a pressure point, intensifying speculation about internal fractures, military loyalty, and what form authority might take in the hours or days ahead. And as commentators debated legality, morality, and strategy, the emotional undercurrent remained unmistakable, because moments like this tap into collective memory, into echoes of past interventions, coups, and conflicts that began with certainty and ended with consequences no one fully anticipated. And throughout the day, analysts reminded audiences that the removal or capture of a leader does not dissolve institutions overnight, that power vacuums rarely remain empty, and that the most volatile phase of any intervention often comes after the initial action, when competing forces move to fill the space left behind. And yet, even with these warnings, the pace of events left little room for reflection. As financial markets reacted nervously, energy traders recalculated risk, and regional neighbors quietly prepared for potential refugee flows, all while social media amplified every claim, denial, and interpretation into a constant roar of competing realities. And in the United States, the domestic response unfolded almost as dramatically as the international one, with supporters framing the moment as a long-awaited reckoning, and opponents questioning the concentration of power required to execute such an action. And between these poles sat a broader public, trying to grasp what this meant, not just for foreign policy, but for the rules that govern it. Because today did not feel like a routine news cycle. It felt like a rupture, a day when the assumptions that had quietly guided global behavior were challenged openly. And as night fell again, the atmosphere remained charged, not with closure, but with anticipation, because no definitive end had been declared, no roadmap unveiled, no consensus reached, only a shared awareness that something profound had shifted. And as a reporter speaking to you in this moment, what is most striking is not only the scale of what has been claimed, but the speed with which the world has been forced to absorb it, process it, and react to it. History is rarely polite enough to announce itself slowly, and today it arrived loudly, abruptly, and without apology, leaving behind a trail of unanswered questions, heightened tensions, and a global audience that understands instinctively that the story is still unfolding, that the consequences have yet to fully surface, and that what began with explosions and declarations may ultimately be remembered for how it reshaped the fragile architecture of power, trust, and restraint that holds the modern world together.